and welcome back to the Experience Lounge podcast. This is episode 41. We have surpassed the 40, the big 40, which is, quite monumental. But yes, welcome back to everyone, episode 41, and a really special episode, sad but also exciting. This is going to be the last episode for a little while whilst I go off and have a baby. That's the plan. So
yes,
this episode will drop hopefully once my baby has arrived. So yes, this marks the last one for a little while whilst I take some maternity leave, and then we will be back in the not too distant future. So please don't worry too much, but you have got 41 episodes to sit through. So if you're new to the podcast, plenty of content for you to enjoy. But before we get into today's episode, which is a very reflective one and kind of looking ahead to next year, Laura, how are you doing?
I am good. I was gonna say I had a lovely time on holiday, but then I'm like, people are gonna see that we're
in the same outfit.
So
great acting though. I love that. Was commitment.
So I'm good. As we said before, we're recording a couple of episodes in one day. So no, I'm good. Looking forward actually to going on holiday, which I mentioned in the last episode.
Yes.
Rather than fibbing about the experience that I had. That just shows I'm not a good liar, and I always think that is a good place to be, that I'm not a good liar.
It is. I would have really, had you said that, I would have really gone in and been like, oh yeah, what was your favorite restaurant? What was the weather like on this holiday that you haven't been on yet?
It was really nice, thanks. Yeah. So how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. So yeah, as you said, we're recording these kind of back to back. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to update everybody on, but no, interesting kind of work related call out. So I wrapped up a very short term engagement with a big client of mine, probably the biggest brand I've worked with to date. And you know what, it was a real success. And I don't think we talk about projects that are on time enough, but it was a project that was delivered on time and exceeded expectations. And the team learned a lot about EX listening and research. So I'm glad. I feel like I'm finishing work on a high. So I just wanted to call that out.
Good.
So if you're working on a project and it's going well and you're sticking to your timelines, it must mean that you have a boutique consultancy working with you, because that just wouldn't have happened with a big consultancy. I'm joking. But congrats to you, I think. So something to be celebrated. But anyway, I digress. We are going to be talking today about looking ahead to 2023. And I can't believe we're saying that because we're recording this in September, but we're going to be talking about EX trends for next year, as well as kind of a reflection on some of the big, I guess, milestones in the EX space this year. So what have we seen? It's been quite a interesting year for employee experience. We're all grappling with this kind of return to office piece, especially. So we wanted to do a bit of reflection on that. So we're going to start with kind of what have been the defining moments for EX in 2022, and then we'll kind of set ourselves forward for 2023. So with that in mind, and before we jump into that, just as we're wrapping up, I did want to call out a couple of good virtual courses, because I get asked this a lot. Laura, you're probably the same. I get asked all the time, I want to get into employee experience design. What would I recommend? And we will, of course, leave links in the show notes for you. But there are three I want to call out. The first is the Luma Institute, which Laura and I have completed our human-centered design practitioner training with. And we definitely rate them. It's a really great interactive human-centered design course. And it's live. And I think that makes all the difference. So I would definitely say Luma is number one for me. So if you're looking for a course, definitely check them out. IDOU do similar ones. So I finished a designing strategy one a few weeks ago. We spoke about that on the podcast. But IDOU, again, very similar around design thinking. So you've got lots of options there. And then the last one that I'd call out is a brand called AJ and Smart. Have you heard of these guys, Laura? No. So they're a UX design agency. I think they're based in Amsterdam. I could be wrong, or Berlin. I'm not entirely sure. But they have a huge presence on YouTube. So if you search AJ and Smart on YouTube, you'll find loads of their videos, but they run some courses as well on kind of design thinking workshop training and facilitation. So I would definitely call those out as well. So just a little feature before we jump into the discussion today. If you're looking for some training, you need to go and ask for some budget to do some training next year. Those are just some thoughts on courses. But any thoughts from you, Laura?
No, I think they would be similar to what I would recommend too. Biggest one I'm most familiar with is Luma, so I would definitely recommend that one. And I think on our Instagram we've shared some books before too, right, of some good ones to have a read. I think there's more out there now than there used to be even a couple of years ago for people to sort of get upskilled in some of the techniques. Yeah, definitely. Fabulous. Okay, so question 1 for today's episode. What have been some of the defining EX moments for you this year, Laura? So I think one's probably, and we mentioned it briefly in an episode recently around quiet quitting. And I said the same then, that I think the term's slightly misleading, but it basically has meant that people, it's not that they wouldn't do a good job, but they would not necessarily kind of kill themselves to go above and beyond or always be switched on and available. So I almost think the term doesn't actually really describe what it is actually, but I think that's definitely been one that I've seen sort of talked about a lot on LinkedIn and sort of other news outlets as well. And I think the other one that really has stuck in my mind this year is an extension of hybrid working. So we talked a lot earlier in the year and possibly even last year actually on the podcast around future of work, hybrid working, as COVID restrictions were starting to lift in a number of countries. What was the sort of lasting impact in terms of hybrid working and that sort of offering for organizations? But I've certainly seen that pivot this year, and almost to more be about how can we make this actually embed and land. And I'm sort of seeing this real dichotomy between the sort of individual need for flexibility versus the kind of corporate need for productivity and innovation. And I think it's creating a lot of tension in terms of almost like what's the right way to do hybrid. And for me, the jury's still out, in the sense of I don't think there's the blueprint, and I think it depends a lot on, you know, your industry, the type of organization you are, the culture you're trying to drive. But some real challenges I think that organizations are starting to work through from an EX perspective around, actually there are some real benefits, but there's also challenges. And I don't think organizations have kind of either thought those fully through or worked those fully through yet. So they've been a couple of big ones. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. And it's been really interesting, especially with that kind of hybrid working, return to office piece as well. Like
even the language is interesting, right?
I actually find myself correcting people now quite confidently when they say return to work, and I'm like, are you saying we haven't been working for the last few years? Because that's rude. But return to office, I think, like you say, everyone's grappling with it. We've seen people, you know, large companies like Google flip-flop around this, Apple struggling with it. We've seen like the Elon Musks of the world coming out and saying very bold things like, if you're not coming back for 40 hours, go and find a new job. So I think that has certainly been really quite a defining piece for EX this year. I think the other thing we've seen across the board is kind of quite emotive health-related programs. So menopause at work was a big one. I feel like more so at the start of the year, we saw loads of organizations come out with that, as well as pregnancy loss, which we'll talk about more at the end of this episode. But pregnancy loss at work, and then one I've seen coming up recently is campaigns around pap smears, and so offering, you know, dedicated time off to go and attend your pap smear appointment. So I think that's also been quite defining, because I think it means we're moving more towards thoughtful programs of support and leave and so on. So I'd also say those things like menopause at work was definitely a big one, pregnancy loss at work. And then another one that we spoke about, Roe v Wade. I think that was a really defining one this year. Not just because it was huge and, you know, a real kind of landmark for a lot of people, but also because I think it kind of spun up this conversation about organizations having or taking a stance on social issues. I think that's been a real catalyst. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the piece. When we talked in the Gen Z discussion about employee activism, there have been some examples this year, I think, and Roe versus Wade is one, and the overturning of that around what is the stance that organizations will come out with. And we sort of said, sometimes that's erring on the side of it being more liberal. But I think organizations are grappling with, you can't isolate certain groups of employees because that's actually not inclusive. So I think that's a real challenge. And I do think that's going to get more difficult for organizations to sort of think through in that EX space. And how do you sort of make sure that if it is quite a divisive topic, that it's also one that doesn't divide your employee base. I think that's going to be super important for sure as well.
Absolutely. So moving on to question 2 then, looking ahead, what do we think is going to linger? What do you think we'll still be grappling with from an EX perspective next year?
So I do think hybrid working, because I think it's here to stay, because I think that point around the tension between the individual and the collective, I just don't think people are going to give up what they perceive as almost that right to flexibility, because I think during COVID, we saw what it meant. And it's that sort of going back to purpose and work, not just being, the sort of a broader sense of self. And I think that ability, when you offer flexi working, that means you can navigate that around your childcare commitments, or if you've got care and responsibilities for perhaps older parents as an example, or even actually if you don't have care and responsibilities, and it might just be that an optimal way to work means that you can flex your day around being able to exercise or get some time out in nature, whatever it might be. I just think people value that more from a mental health perspective and well-being than they ever did, and I think the tension is from an employee base. I don't think people want to let go of that, and they expect that now. And I still firmly believe, and this is sort of a personal view of my own, but I think employees will vote with their feet, in the sense that they will either leave and try and find other organizations that align more with that flexibility they might be looking for, or they'll dig their heels in. And I think then organizations need to question sort of how far are you going to push it? Because if we got into a sort of culture where people were getting disciplined because they're not sort of working in the mandated way, I don't know if that sort of feels like that's not necessarily a culture that some organizations would want to drive. So I think it's a really, really tricky topic now to navigate, as lots of organizations I think are feeling that. So that's one definitely for me. The other, and this is something I certainly feel in the UK, because there is a lot in the media, some of that is sensationalization, but it's still true. A huge kind of cost of living crisis is looming, the impact of that on people's household bills, decisions that they might make about heating their homes for the winter. Whether I think that could play out in terms of impact around commuting into the office, or even perceived things around, I will come into the office more because I want to be visible. And I'm doing visible for those that are listening on audio in air quotes, because I think that sort of, I say perceived almost presenteeism, but if you're sort of thinking about, if we're going into a bit of an economic downturn, organizations typically may be looking to, make some redundancies, some layoffs. And there is, I think, a perceived view that if you're more physically visible, you might be safe in some way. So yeah, I just think it all sort of play out some interesting behaviours. And I do sort of think in the context of, if you do have cost of living crisis in different countries and that economic downturn, from an EX perspective, do we look at topics around things like financial well-being?
Yeah.
And I think they will sort of, you know, play more of a role from an EX perspective. But what else do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think certainly super pronounced at the moment in the UK, cost of living crisis, and, you know, gas prices, especially over the winter. And I agree with you. I think we're really going to see the fallout of that next year, not just in the UK, but everywhere as well, for sure. I think we'll also see the grappling around social and political issues. I think that will extend into next year. You know, we actually called this out on Instagram recently. So if you're not following us, go and follow us there. But there's going to be a lot more coming our way from the US Supreme Court around more than just Roe v Wade, around, you know, gay rights in particular. And so with that being said, given what we saw this year with Roe v Wade, I think also what we'll see is organisations grappling with what kind of voice do we have externally, how involved do we get, but also how do we get ahead of this, right? So, you know, with Roe v Wade, there were some organisations that knew this was coming and prepared for announcements and programmes to support their employees well in advance. So I think that will also exist. If I sound out of breath, it's because I am very out of breath, people. So
when you've got a baby pushing on your diaphragm,
exactly,
do that to you.
So bear with me. The other thing I think, just kind of building on that hybrid working piece, is actually I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in the workplace, as in physical workplace, as well.
I think so.
I think, and I'm excited to see it. So one thing, you know, I've seen a few kind of more provocative LinkedIn posts saying, do we ban laptops in the office? So when people come into the office, they don't bring their laptop and it's pure collaboration. And then I wonder, you know, my mind whirls then, because I'm like, oh, what does that mean for collaboration space? Like, will it become more like a design thinking in a kind of incubator? Like, how amazing would that be? So I also think from an EX perspective, this is really important, because I think the physical workplace will shift so much, and I'm actually super excited to see what comes out of that. What do you think?
I've read some interesting research by people like Linda Grattan at the London Business School, very much kind of positioning the office as a collaboration tool. So it has to be seen as a tool in the same way you'd look at MS Teams or Zoom or any of those, or, you know, when we talk about Mural or Miro and any of those, that the office then becomes effectively an additional tool in your toolkit, and you use it for, you know, for certain things. And the point you sort of said about the laptop is really interesting, because actually, even from my own personal experience, quite often now when I go in, I structure my day so I have 100% face-to-face meetings. So I try not to do any video calls. Occasionally it sort of slips if, you know, you can't say no, but most of the time I do. And the last sort of few times I've not taken my laptop. I've just took my iPad where I can access emails. But I've generally found, because I'm structuring that day around, you know, social connection, face-to-face meetings, I don't need a laptop because I'm meeting people face-to-face. And I think that makes it really interesting. But it really requires effort to be really purposeful about structuring your week in that way. And I think the challenge is, and this is the bit I guess organizations are grappling with, is an individual schedule versus the collective schedule. And I think that's the bit that is still the question mark for me, I think. But yeah, I think we will see some really cool, innovative office spaces, because they have to look different. And I think it's also to attract people back in. Like, I've seen quite a lot, you know, external research as well, that is saying you have to give employees a reason why, because they're sitting there going, well, if you want me to go in and do a bunch of video calls, I'm not going to do that. So
absolutely,
then there needs to be something else. So I think that's a big one for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping to question 3 then, what do we predict in terms of new trends or focus areas for next year? So again, we're kind of going to caveat this. These are our predictions. They're not based on anything other than our gut feeling really at this point. But what do you think, Laura? What do you think is going to be new next year?
Coming off mute there. So one that we touched upon a little bit in the Gen Z episode was around mentoring, and that I can't remember the exact stats, but there had been organizations that had seen, kind of increases in productivity, etc., by mandating mentoring. So I think that will be a big one. So for organizations to look at how would you drive forward some of those programs, but almost actually from an employee experience perspective, make that an experience that is accessible for all. Because I think historically mentoring has been something that you might have been on a program because there's almost a specific, that the program's got something specific about it as to why you would be on that program. Like it could be a female talent one as an example, or, and this is sort of also in my experience, you've kind of sought mentors out based on where you might be in a career journey and thinking about that sort of career development. So I think something around kind of mandating that is really interesting, because it sort of gives everybody almost more of a equitable footing in terms of access to that kind of experience. And like we've said, reverse mentoring for me is a big one that I genuinely think in a good mentor relationship you learn both ways, because, and whether that's generational or it's different part of the business or somebody's different perspective, I think that's so important as well, that you're both learning. So I think that would be one. What are some of those that you foresee?
I totally agree with you. There are a couple. I think I'm trying to pick from the list here that I put, like my predictions. Which ones do I like the most? I think I'll go for the first one. I think EX beyond the workplace is a big one, and I mentioned this when we did our Gen Z episode. But how do we bring more of that external data into our experience design? So this is quite specific to EX, but I think, we talk a lot about experience data being, could be reports that we're able to run internally from our analytics team, but also employee listening. But actually, I think there's going to be another facet of that, which will be the pulse of the organization externally. And I think we talk about it kind of hypothetically at the moment, like maybe one person goes out and looks at Glassdoor. But I think actually we're going to see this kind of EX external listening become a lot more sophisticated and a little bit more plugged in to more frequent checks of how are people describing working for us outside of the organization? What do they say about us on Fishbowl? Those kind of things. So I think I see that as a new trend next year. I think that's going to become a really significant part of the EX listening, EX data debate, for sure. The other thing I would also call out is community at work. So, and I had a really interesting call with someone who is looking to develop a solution in this space, and trying to get creative with how do we build community at work to get people in the office, but also where we have hybrid working, so that we're also not excluding those people as well. So we know that communities help people to feel a sense of belonging, they foster collaboration. But I think we're going to see some really exciting new tools in this space next year. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think there is the piece around in this sort of COVID context. I think maybe some of the negatives that people talked about was you didn't kind of have some of those kind of serendipitous connections. But I think by having some of those, it does kind of focus around that broader sense of community. So I think if we are talking about hybrid, you've got to be more purposeful about how do you sort of switch that together. And I've sort of had some really interesting conversations kind of internally, externally, also thinking about the sort of almost the corporate citizen and being part of a community of people with a common purpose versus, again, that individual need. And that's something that I just feel it's like a pendulum that you're sort of gonna, have this balance. And I think that's sort of going to play out even more next year. And I think the sort of other one is kind of thinking about how we actually do predict some of those trends. So the two standout ones for me, and just thinking about where they came from, is the quiet quitting, and also the kind of great resignation and great reshuffle. And I think if organizations or EX leaders, HR practitioners can be getting ahead, and that might be, how do they sort of almost like find out some of that intel in the market, what are they seeing on social media, all of that sort of stuff, that almost then maybe starts to pick out some of these trends or terms, because it's just I just find it actually really fascinating, like how the concepts of things like quiet quitting, great reshuffle, great resignation, they sort of became a thing, like almost
overnight,
snowballed, right? Like just snowballed in terms of that being something that that people talked about. And then obviously what happens, the podcast, the the articles, all that kind of stuff. So I almost think, how can organizations unpick some of that? And I don't even know if that's like a really good social media team, or it's something about how do you dig into the dialogue that might not always be seen and heard, that then creates one of these trends, and it sort of snowballs, right?
Yeah, totally agree. I wonder if that sits in the same camp as kind of like getting ahead of the Roe V Wade thing. Like, you almost need like a social media person or like a media person in your HR team that can say, here's what we're seeing. Or, it becomes part of, I don't know, even like your monthly team meetings, that you get someone to do a feature on what's going on in the external market. What's the pulse? What are people talking about?
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. And I think as well, and I got this from TikTok really, but this, and you mentioned this in the Gen Z episode actually, so if you haven't listened to that, do go back and listen to it. But this kind of, Gen Z are interviewing the organization a lot more rigorously now, so they want to know. And this comes back to a TikTok I saw where someone was like, if you were really honest and it was a real two-way interview, you'd say things like, so tell me about the last person that left in your team. Have you ever promoted anyone in your team? How would people describe you as a people manager? And these are all really relevant questions. And so the other thing that I would say, maybe not next year, but maybe the following year, is we might start to see, how do we create candidate experience environments that foster that two-way questioning? And it's uncomfortable for organizations, but how can we get to a point where we say, we encourage candidates to ask those challenging questions, or maybe we train our managers to be forthcoming with that information so that it's totally transparent. I don't know if that's a trend for next year. I don't know if it's really a trend, but what do you think?
But I think it's interesting when you think of maybe historically how we've looked at things like, say, competency-based interviews, and sort of shift that, sort of almost like, how do you assess performance and potential as the interviewer, but also create the space for the dialogue around some of those themes? Because actually, like you say, those questions are really, really, really telling the important questions, like how an interviewer would answer that question around like, what kind of people leader are you, or how would you describe the culture at the organization? Like, they're all questions that candidates should be able to ask. So it's almost, I think, how is the kind of assessment for potential, and I think on both sides, how does that sort of play out in a different way? And that for me then means, your recruitment teams, your talent teams are going to have to think differently, and there's then probably a space, I'm sure, for some vendors to come in and think about tools that we can use to do some of that, like almost something that's perhaps a bit of a something that sort of tests the potential and the competence versus the fit to the organization. And for me, that's beyond things like a behaviors assessment, which I think a lot of organizations already do. It's more than that. It's that dialogue, I think. Yeah. I agree. So those were a few predictions. Do let us know, as always, probably more so on Instagram, get in touch, let us know what do you think's coming next year.
because I'm sure there's plenty that we haven't covered, but always nice to kind of reflect on this year. I think it's been a pretty intense year, I'll be honest. I think it's been a good year though. I think I'm super excited to see EX gaining pace, you know, more EX courses coming out, more people talking about it, conferences kind of really pivoting to that full EX focus. So overall reflection, it's been a good year for EX, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I sort of feel on that maturity matrix of where, you know, where we're sort of getting to with employee experience, it has felt like a shifting gear, I think, this year.
Yeah.
And still 3 months left. So there might be another, who knows, right? There might be another quiet quitting, great resignation, great reshuffle. Get out there and look at people's Instagram stories, TikTok, and that'll give you the answer, I think.
Absolutely. But don't spend too much time on TikTok. I have a love-hate relationship with it. I download it and then I remove it, and then I download it again and then I remove it, because it's really and
I also think I'm probably showing my age here. I just haven't really got on with it. I've always been a bit like, yeah, let's say I'm one of those.
It's fine.
So
all good.
Yes.
So yes, that was our reflection on this year and kind of some thoughts on next year. So it'll be really interesting to see what transpires. But before we wrap up today's episode, we know the timing of this one is going to be around Baby Loss Awareness Week 2022. And as everybody knows, we've been very vocal on this podcast about pregnancy loss and baby loss, and so we definitely wanted to nod to it, I think. So I mean, Laura, any thoughts you'd like to share, kind of reflections? I know it's been a really hard year for you and you were very vulnerable in sharing your story with us a few episodes ago, so yeah, any thoughts from you?
I think probably first one is our DMs are always open. Probably the timing of Baby Loss Awareness Week less so for you, because you will be in the throes of the newborn days. But yeah, definitely mine are always open, because I think for me, I always had is understanding the right word? Like I don't know, I'm trying to think about phrasing it the right way. When you've been through it, it's just different, I think. And I feel others, that when I've talked about it and others has opened up to me about it, it feels like there's support there. And I did reach out a lot during my experience earlier this year online, and some of the communities on Instagram and, you know, with the forums. So I think the first thing I'd say is my DMs would always be open on Instagram or in LinkedIn, just to talk about it with people. I think the other is doing what you need to do for you is probably a key thing. And one of my biggest learnings was kind of communicating to, and especially in a work context, communicating what I needed. And I think maybe some people wouldn't feel as comfortable doing that, but I think it's individual for each person. You know, like I know people that might have been through multiple losses and it was never something they wanted to discuss at work, whereas actually I didn't sort of do like a broadcast, obviously, but I did tell, you know, people that I trusted, and it then meant that it kept the dialogue going, and people would ask how I was doing, and I sort of really appreciated that, because it does sort of take time. I think the other thing I would say is, with any grief, it goes up and down. So I sort of remember kind of going through my loss. We went into the Jubilee weekend for the Queen's Jubilee, and I think then I went on holiday and then was back at work, and almost that sort of, it felt like I was then back in sort of, you know, I guess a sort of, I don't know if BAU is the right word, but that kind of mode. And but then sometimes it would just hit me, and I think that's the thing, that it isn't going to be linear. It will be, you know, up and down. And I then also think when you go to try again, that level of anxiety, I think, will always be there. And I think that's really challenging, because I think we said it when we did the Roe versus Wade, it takes away some of the hope, right?
Yeah, so for sure. Yeah.
What about you? What would be your sort of reflections?
Oh, goodness. Well, I feel like I've come full circle since the last Baby Loss Awareness Week. Like, you know, you asked me last year and I was in a really terrible spot. And
It's really raw.
Yeah. So, and like kind of coming around this year, you know, and you touched on a really good point. Like I'm at this point 35 weeks pregnant and I'm so full of hope, but I'm also still petrified. And until, you know, my son is here, it will always be a really anxious time. And I think that's the other element of it, is pregnancy after loss is, you know, we talk about miscarriage leave and taking time off, you know, when you have a loss, which is super important, but also that support post loss, and when you're pregnant again and you're kind of going through it, you know, that's when you need a community around you as well, and you need a tribe, and you need to feel comfortable talking openly and being vulnerable about your anxiety. And, you know, not to make this too much about the workplace, but I think it's really important then that comes back to kind of like manager enablement, especially around, you know, how do you support someone who is going through a pregnancy after loss, because it is a very fundamentally different experience in my view. And so, you know, I'm full of hope this year, and a slightly different perspective, but I just think it's such an important week. And as always, similar to you, Laura, my DMs are open. It might take me a while to reply this year, hopefully. But yeah, I just think it's such an important year. And for anyone going through it, or if you've landed on this podcast because you've gone through a loss, you just know, you know, we're with you and you have our support, and we're here if you ever need to talk. So 100% getting behind Baby Loss Awareness Week again this year. And would say if you're a corporate looking to give your money to a charity this year, Tommy's is the one I want to call out. Absolutely. I would not be this heavily pregnant if it were not for Tommy's. They connected us to a fantastic doctor who gave us all the medication and all the testing in the world to find out what was wrong. And so, yeah, I'm just forever grateful for them and the work they do. So throw your money their way this year. Make a donation. Finish this episode and go and make a donation to Tommy's, definitely.
Yeah. And I think the point you raised about, for me, it's sort of that psychological safety and thinking about how you create that in a work context, because it will be a really anxious time, and it might not be, you know, something that the person wants to share with everybody that they work with, but that they feel comfortable to be able to tell key people, I think, that this is going to make you anxious. And we all know anxiety can then impact, you know, how you might do your job. So I think that's super important. And it's one of those things where it's not something that managers, people, leaders would necessarily go through that regularly. So, but it's one of those experiences that when it happens, if you sort of get the right support, I think can really make a difference. So I would sort of say be making sure you're investing time and, you know, thinking through things like support, guidance, and Tommy's do like a great partnership with organizations like Bupa, where they've got a program which is dedicated to employees and managers, where colleagues will have gone through baby loss, like whether that's a miscarriage or a, you know, termination for medical reasons or stillbirth, or even actually a sort of, you know, early kind of infant loss as well. So that I think that's they offer a lot of support. So I agree. I think it's a great charity.
Definitely, for sure. So yes, and that really marks our last episode for the foreseeable. I can't believe it. What's that song? You know, we've come to the end of the road. That really cheesy song. I won't do a rendition, but hey guys, it's been a pleasure. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to the podcast. You know, we're not going to be gone forever. Just do expect a couple of months of silence from us, just whilst I get into this new world of motherhood, I guess. Yeah, exactly. And of course we'll keep you posted. So follow us on Instagram. That is where we will probably announce the birth of little boy. So it's been a pleasure, guys. We'll see you soon.
We will see you soon. Take
care. Bye.